My name is Gabriel Allen, and in 2017, I took my RV down to the rugged expanse of Big Bend National Park in Texas. Being a history teacher, I figured a solo trip might give me some new stories to spice up my lectures, or at least a decent tan. The open road was my escape from the usual grind of grading papers and dodging PTA meetings. I packed the essentials: canned beans, a stack of unread novels, and my old guitar. Nothing says midlife crisis like a man in his RV heading into the desert. As I drove deeper into the park, the scenery shifted from scrubby desert to towering canyons. The Rio Grande snaked its way through the landscape, a shimmering ribbon dividing two countries. I found a secluded spot near the river, far from any designated campground, peaceful and, more importantly, no Wi-Fi. Just the way I wanted it. Setting up camp, I felt a wave of contentment. No emails, no student excuses about why their homework was late, just me in the vast wilderness. I strummed a few chords on my guitar, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls. The sun began to set, turning the sky into a masterpiece of reds and oranges. As night fell, I lit a small campfire and heated up some beans. The crackling fire and distant howls of coyotes were my only companions. Just as I was contemplating turning in, a faint light flickered atop a nearby ridge. Probably another camper, or perhaps a park ranger. I shrugged it off. After all, the desert is big enough for the both of us. The next morning, I decided to hike along the riverbank. The air was crisp and the scenery was postcard perfect. About an hour in, I stumbled upon something odd. A campsite that looked like it had been hit by a tornado. A tent lay torn open, and belongings were scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. Amid the mess, an old, weather-beaten journal caught my eye. Curiosity piqued. I picked it up. Flipping through the pages, I realized it belonged to someone named Logan Cooper. His last entry was 2 days prior, mentioning explorations of nearby caves and strange symbols etched into the walls. The final line read, "I feel like I'm being watched." "Well, that's not creepy at all," I muttered. Maybe Logan was auditioning for a horror novel. Still, a chill ran down my spine, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. On my way back, I crossed paths with an old man carrying a heavy backpack. He had a face like worn leather and eyes that seemed to hold too many secrets. "Morning," I greeted. He gave me a long, searching look. "You out here alone?" "Just me and my RV," I replied with a grin. "Figured I'd get away from it all." He nodded slowly. "Be careful. The desert has a way of revealing things you'd rather not see." Great. Cryptic warnings from the desert sage. Next, he'll tell me to avoid the haunted cactus. "Thanks for the tip," I said aloud. "I'll keep an eye out." He stared a moment longer before continuing down the trail. Odd fellow, but I chalked it up to too much sun and not enough social interaction. Back at camp, the unease lingered. To distract myself, I decided to drive into the nearest town for supplies. The town was the quintessential dot on the map. A gas station, a diner, and a general store that looked like it hadn't changed since the 50s. At the diner, I ordered a coffee and struck up a conversation with the waitress. "Say, you wouldn't happen to know a Logan Cooper, would you?" I asked. She paused, her smile fading. "Can't say I do. Why do you ask?" "Found his journal near an abandoned campsite. Thought he might be a local." She leaned in. "People go missing out here from time to time. Vast place, easy to get lost." "Comforting?" I said with a half smile. "Remind me to leave a breadcrumb trail back to my RV." She didn't laugh. "You be careful now. Stick to the main roads." "Will do," I assured her, though my mind was already spinning tales. As I left, I couldn't help but notice the few locals in the diner eyeing me with what seemed like suspicion. Or was it pity? Either way, it was time to head back. That evening, the desert felt different. The silence was heavier, the shadows longer. I decided to stay inside the RV and dive into one of those novels I'd been meaning to read. Around midnight, a tapping sound jolted me from the pages. It was coming from the rear of the RV. Probably just a desert squirrel auditioning for a horror movie, I thought. But then I remembered. No trees. No squirrels. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The night was still, the moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. I walked around the RV but saw nothing. Just as I was about to chalk it up to my imagination, I heard footsteps crunching behind me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice betraying a hint of nerves. Silence. I swept the flashlight around. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure in the distance, but it was too dark to be sure. My heart pounded. I backed toward the RV. A whisper floated on the wind. "Not safe here." I spun around. No one. "All right, Gabriel. Either you're losing it or someone's playing a very unfunny joke," I muttered. Back inside, I locked the doors and decided that sleep was the best escape. Morning couldn't come soon enough. Stepping outside, I stretched and tried to shake off the night's weirdness. Then I saw it. Scratched into the side of my RV were the words, "Not alone." "Well, isn't that just peachy?" I said aloud. Maybe it was the desert's way of saying welcome. I decided then and there to pack up and move to a different spot. Or better yet, head home. As I started the engine, I glanced in the side mirror. A man stood about 50 yards away, watching me. It was the old man from the trail, but his expression had shifted from mysterious to menacing. Time to go. I put the RV in gear. Driving down the winding road, I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe the locals didn't like outsiders. Maybe this was their way of scaring me off. If so, mission accomplished. Rounding a bend, I slammed on the brakes. A pickup truck was parked across the road, blocking my path. Before I could react, two men emerged, the old man and a younger guy with a scruffy beard and cold eyes. Both held rifles pointed directly at me. "Step out of the vehicle." The younger man ordered. "Is this about my extended warranty?" I quipped, hoping humor might diffuse the tension. "No," he barked. With no other option, I stepped out, hands raised. "Look, if this is about camping fees, I'm happy to pay." "Empty your pockets," the younger man demanded. I tossed my wallet and keys to the ground. "Take whatever you want," the old man sneered. "It's not about what you have, it's about what you know." "Okay, you've lost me," I said, heart pounding. "You found Logan's journal," he stated. "Logan? The guy whose campsite looked like a tornado hit it?" "Yeah, I found his journal. Didn't know it was a crime." The younger man stepped closer. "You read it?" "That just enough to realize the Yelp reviews for this place are severely lacking," I replied. He didn't appreciate the joke. "You think this is funny?" "Not particularly," I admitted. "But I've always been told I laugh in the face of danger. Bad habit." The old man raised his rifle. "Enough. We can't let you leave." "Wait, hold on," I said, thinking fast. "If you let me go, I'll forget I ever saw you. Promise. Cross my heart and hope to, well, you get the idea." They weren't buying it. Desperate, I feigned a stumble, reaching down as if to steady myself. My hand closed around a fist-sized rock. In one swift motion, I hurled it at the young man's face. It struck him square on the nose. He screamed, dropping his rifle. Seizing the moment, I bolted toward the scrubland. Bullets kicked up dust around me as the old man fired. Adrenaline surged. I zigzagged, hoping to make myself a harder target. "Split up!" I heard the old man shout. Ducking behind a cluster of rocks, I tried to catch my breath. This is not how I envisioned this trip going, I thought. Next time, all-inclusive resort it is. I needed a plan. Peering around, I saw the younger man circling wide, blood streaming from his nose. The old man was methodically checking hiding spots. Spotting a fallen tree branch, I grabbed it and waited. As the younger man approached, I swung with everything I had. The branch connected with a satisfying thud. He crumpled to the ground. "One down?" I whispered, though I knew the old man was still out there, and armed. I picked up the younger man's rifle. It felt heavy and unfamiliar. Should have paid more attention during those video game tutorials, I mused. Making my way back toward the road, I kept low. The old man was nowhere in sight. Reaching the RV, I climbed in, started the engine, and floored it. As I sped down the road, the old man appeared ahead, standing in the middle of the path, rifle raised. A shot rang out, shattering the windshield. Glass sprayed everywhere, but I didn't slow down. "Sorry, no time for roadblocks," I muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. At the last second, he dove out of the way. I sped past, heart pounding, knuckles white. Hours later, I reached the park entrance and found a ranger station. Bursting inside, I tried to explain between gasps. The ranger stared at me, eyes wide. "Calm down, sir. Tell me exactly what happened." After relaying the events, law enforcement was called in. They found the younger man unconscious where I'd left him. The old man had vanished. A search of the area uncovered shallow graves, the remains of several missing persons, including Logan Cooper. The reality was grimmer than I could have imagined. Turns out Samuel Granger, the old man, was a former military survivalist gone rogue. He believed the desert was his domain and that outsiders were trespassers to be eliminated. His accomplice, Jacob Mills, had a record of violent offenses. Together, they had been preying on unsuspecting campers for years. "Well, that's one way to discourage tourism," I remarked when the detective briefed me. "You're lucky to be alive," he replied. "Trust me, I don't feel particularly lucky." They advised me to stay in town until they could ensure my safety. Jacob was in custody, but Samuel was still at large. A few days later, I received a package at the motel, no return address. Inside was a single item, Logan Cooper's journal. Tucked between the pages was a note in scrawled handwriting. "The desert keeps its secrets." "Well, that's not ominous at all," I sighed. Law enforcement took it as a threat. They offered protective custody, but I declined. "I think I've had enough of small towns and deserts," I told them. "Time to get back to grading essays on the Industrial Revolution." I returned home, the comforts of suburban life never more appealing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel was still out there, lurking in the vastness of the desert. One evening, as I was locking up my house, I noticed a figure at the end of the street. For a moment, panic surged, but as the figure approached, I realized it was just my neighbor walking his dog. "Evening, Gabriel," he called. "Evening," I replied, shaking off the paranoia. Inside, I sat down and opened a book, but my mind wandered. Maybe a self-defense class wouldn't be a bad idea. Or a really big dog. In the end, the authorities never found Samuel Granger. They believed he retreated deeper into the wilderness, his twisted mission unfinished. But they dismantled his operation and uncovered his crimes. They told me Samuel was a man driven mad by isolation and delusions of ownership over a land that belonged to no one. His motivations were rooted in a warped ideology that saw travelers like me as intruders to be eradicated. As for me, I decided future vacations would involve beaches, piña coladas, and lots of people. My name is Smith Gonzalez, and all of this happened to me back in 2000 at the Great Sand Dunes National Park in southern Colorado, where I was working as a junior ranger straight out of a 3-year forestry program with a desperate need to prove myself. I remember it started in late August. The summer crowds had thinned, and the dunes stretched out quiet under a blue sky that never seemed to end. We had fewer visitors that week, mostly older couples taking slow hikes and a handful of backpackers testing their endurance on the sandy slopes. My supervisor, Clara Ortiz, insisted I carry extra water bottles and a small first aid kit. She liked saying, "Dylan, those dunes are pretty until someone twists an ankle." Clara was older than me by at least 16 years and had a dry sense of humor that made me laugh even on stressful days. I had been eating a stale granola bar for lunch near the small visitor center around noon. It was hot, but not unbearable. I remember the air smelled faintly of warm sand and juniper. We had gotten a shipment of new trail markers the week before, and I planned to spend my afternoon swapping out old, faded signs along the perimeter trails. Around 1:30, Clara radioed me. Her voice crackled. "Vic, you see anything off today? We got a hiker who checked in this morning and never returned. Name's Alan Chan, mid-20s, came alone." I replied that I had seen a solitary guy in a wide-brimmed hat heading toward the dunes, but nothing strange. Clara sighed. "Keep your eyes open. He didn't come back to his car. Maybe he wandered off route." I set out with a cautious stride, feeling a mild worry settle in my stomach. It was not unusual for someone to lose track of time. The dunes could be disorienting. Still, I felt uneasy. I hiked for about an hour, drifting toward a remote section where the sand piled high and the wind hummed in my ears. The clouds shifted overhead, turning the sky an odd shade of purple. By late afternoon, I found a bottle half buried in the sand that looked like the brand we sold at the visitor center. The bottle was cracked, and there was a small dark stain on the sand nearby that I first thought was spilled juice or maybe coffee. I knelt down. It looked more like dried blood. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but my hands shook a bit. I radioed Clara. She told me, "Stay calm. Mark the spot. I'm sending Thomas and Aaron out to meet you." Thomas was a young seasonal ranger from Arizona, always cracking jokes. Aaron was a wildlife technician who rarely smiled but knew every bird species in the park. I waited. The sun sank lower, painting long shadows across the dunes. We had maybe 2 hours of decent light left. My mouth went dry, and I sipped from my canteen. Thomas and Aaron arrived, breathing hard. Thomas, seeing my tense face, gave a half smile. "You look like you found something nasty," he said. Aaron examined the sand, nudging it with a boot. "That's blood," she said softly. I nodded and showed them the bottle. It might be the missing hikers. We spread out in a careful line, calling out the man's name. "Alan! Hey, Alan!" The wind swallowed our voices. I saw nothing but dunes and a few stunted shrubs. About 30 minutes in, Thomas stumbled onto a shoe. It was a hiking boot that looked new. 10 feet away, Aaron found a baseball cap with a sweatband inside. She whispered, "Dylan, over here." I stepped over a gentle rise in the sand and saw something that made my stomach twist. There was a hand protruding from behind a low dune. It looked too still. I rushed over and found the hiker lying on his back, eyes open, face pale. It was not the kind of thing I'd forget. He had been torn open in a way that suggested more than a simple animal attack. His shirt was shredded. There were no footprints that matched a person's boots, only some strange depressions in the sand, as if something heavy had pressed down and slid. Thomas whispered, "What on earth?" And Aaron's face turned ashen. I heard her swallow. I tried to focus, breathing slow, feeling sweat trickle down my back. We agreed to mark the spot and head back to the ranger station. Night was not far off, and we had no desire to stay out there. On the way back, Thomas tried to lighten the mood. "You think it was a cougar?" Aaron shook her head. "No, the pattern's off, and I've never known a cat to leave a body like that." She was known for her blunt honesty. I wished she was less direct right then. We reached the station around dusk. Clara was waiting outside with a flashlight and a worried expression. "We need to report this," she said. "I'll call the sheriff. You three clean yourselves up. Don't say a word to the visitors tonight. We'll handle this quietly." Inside, I washed my hands. I forced down a few crackers. I noticed Aaron pacing, rubbing her temples. Thomas sat in a corner, muttering. "This is bad, really bad." The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies a couple of hours later. They asked us to lead them back to the spot. It was dark, and we carried strong flashlights. The dunes took on a strange quality at night. The moon gave a dull glow. The sheriff shined his light over footprints and mumbled something about needing a tracking specialist. As we approached the site, my heart sank. The body was gone. Only smears of blood remained. Aaron's eyes widened, and Thomas started cursing under his breath. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You sure about what you saw?" he asked in a flat voice. Clara backed us up. "I trust my rangers. Someone moved the body." We fanned out carefully. I tried to stay close to Thomas because he was armed, and I only had a baton and a radio. That's when we heard a scream from the south side of the dunes. It was one of the deputies. We rushed over, stumbling, losing our footing in the sand. When we reached him, he was down, face pressed into the sand, limbs at odd angles. The second deputy shined his flashlight ahead, and for a second, I caught a glimpse of something scuttling behind a tall patch of reeds near a seasonal creek bed. I could not identify it. It was large, maybe the size of a wolf, but too lean, and it moved sideways, as if its back legs were weaker or twisted. We froze. The sheriff shouted, "Who's out there?" He aimed his service weapon. There was no response, only the soft hiss of shifting sand. We pulled the fallen deputy back. He was gone. Whatever had struck him must have hit fast and hard. I felt a wave of nausea. Thomas whispered, "Dylan, we gotta get out of here." I nodded, my throat tight. The sheriff looked rattled now, which made me even more nervous. We carried the deputy's body back toward the station. Aaron kept turning around, shining her flashlight into the darkness. Twice, I thought I saw movement behind us, but I could not be sure. Back at the station, the sheriff radioed for more help. We locked the doors and turned off most lights, except for a small lamp on the desk. Clara stood by the window, holding a rifle that looked too old for comfort. I sat on a stool near the supply cabinet, trying to calm my breathing. Erin paced again, muttering about how no known predators behave this way. She tossed out theories, maybe a rabid coyote or some diseased animal. Thomas said quietly, "Rabid animals don't drag bodies away like they're storing food. They also don't vanish without tracks." Around midnight, we heard something scraping against the outside of the building. It was a light, irregular sound that made my skin prickle. The sheriff killed the main lights and signaled us to stay quiet. I held my breath, gripping the baton with damp palms. Erin picked up a fire extinguisher, her knuckles white. We waited. The scraping moved from one wall to another, as if searching for a way in. I tried to think logically. Maybe it smelled us, maybe it was testing the building. I had no idea what it was, and that was worse than any guess. Thomas whispered a joke, something about how he put in for a transfer to a more peaceful place, like a rest area off the interstate. I let out a shaky snort. Even then, I appreciated his humor. It reminded me that we were still human, still in one piece, at least for the moment. After a few tense minutes, the scraping stopped. The sheriff nodded to Thomas and me. "We need to get back up out here. We can't sit all night." Clara shook her head. "There's a phone line, but it went dead after I called you folks. Radio is unreliable this far out. Reinforcements might come by morning. Until then, we hold tight." We took turns watching the windows. The moonlight slipped through the dusty glass, illuminating small details. A map pinned to the wall, a half-eaten candy bar on Clara's desk, the footprints we had tracked in on the floor. We waited, whispering about what this thing could be. Erin recalled strange reports from old ranchers, talking about predators that adapted to dunes. Thomas rolled his eyes at that, but said nothing. I watched the darkness outside. Every so often, I imagined a shape shifting behind the parked Jeep or near the trailhead sign. Sometime near dawn, we decided to move. If we could reach the main access road a few miles away, maybe we'd flag down a passing vehicle. The sheriff took point. I followed close, with Clara behind me and Erin and Thomas bringing up the rear. We left the safety of the building and stepped onto the cool sand. The sky was paling. We walked in silence, trying to move quickly but quietly. We carried what we could: flashlights, a rifle, a handgun, my baton. We made it about half a mile before I noticed Thomas lagging. "You okay?" I whispered. He nodded but looked nervous. Suddenly, Clara hissed, "Down." We crouched behind a low crest of sand. Ahead, in a patch of scrub, something moved. The sheriff raised his rifle. I could see a shape. It had a broad chest, thin limbs, and a head that seemed too small for its body. The moonlight had been deceptive. Now, in the early dawn, I realized it was covered in sparse, dirty fur, and its body had patches of raw skin. It held something in its jaws, looked like a chunk of fabric. Maybe the hiker's shirt. It made no sound. It moved in a jittery manner, as if injured or struggling. We tried to skirt around it, moving slowly. Erin stepped on a dry twig. The snap echoed. The thing twisted its neck toward us. Without hesitation, the sheriff fired a shot. I expected it to drop, but it scrambled away, kicking up sand and vanishing behind a slope. We hurried on, hearts pounding. Clara mumbled something about how if that shot didn't bring help, nothing would. I kept glancing back, convinced it would return. I never got a good look at its face, just a vague impression of eyes too close together and a snout that didn't quite match anything I'd studied. By the time we hit the main road, the first hints of sunrise painted the dunes orange. We flagged down a park maintenance truck. The driver, a guy named Julio, looked puzzled when we told him what happened. He said he'd get word to the authorities. We piled into the back of his truck and rode in silence, watching the dunes fade behind us. I thought about Alan Chan's family. I thought about that deputy. I felt a strange guilt, as if I had failed them by not understanding what we faced. We never found the creature again, at least not that I know of. The sheriff organized a major search. They found traces of blood and bits of clothing, but no clear answers. Officials suggested it might have been a rare predator, maybe a diseased animal, something that wandered in from a distant habitat. Nothing concrete. Clara quit 2 months later. Aaron transferred to another park. Thomas and I stayed a while longer, keeping our voices low when we talked about that night. Even now, when I think back to that time, I recall the silence in the dunes and the sight of that poor hiker, his body. I remember the scraping on the ranger station walls and how powerless I felt. I can still see something twitching in the half-light, some shape that shouldn't exist, something that had no name. We left that place with a lesson. We are not always at the top of the food chain. Sometimes we stumble on something that wants no part in our world, except to tear it open. I'm not proud of how scared I was, but I'm alive, and that's enough. And I know if I ever return there, I'll keep my distance from the far dunes, moving only in broad daylight, always checking the sand behind me. I grew up in Missouri, just outside Jefferson City. Not that it has much to do with what happened, but I always figured I'd stay near the same place. Get a house, maybe some land, and live out my days in relative quiet. Never thought my life would take me into the mountains of New Mexico on a classified mission involving a whole lot more blood than I ever imagined. But hey, life's funny like that, isn't it? Well, funny isn't exactly the word for it. It was 2004, and I was still serving as a Green Beret. A quiet deployment, they said, and the paperwork wasn't much different from the usual load I'd gotten used to over the years. Nothing in the briefing hinted at what we were about to face. No, they had us geared up for a routine job. Basic extraction of some lost scientist who'd gotten himself caught in a place he had no business being. I was leading a small team into the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. No big deal, right? If you only knew. Now, the Sangre de Cristo range has a reputation, but it's not something you see advertised on travel brochures. Rugged terrain, unpredictable weather, and sometimes other things. The locals had their stories, but you could chalk them up to folk tales. Only now, I wonder just how much they left out. The start went well enough, quiet, uneventful. As we hiked through the forest, the air felt heavy though, like something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the lack of animal sounds. Normally, in a place like this, you'd hear the usual birds, insects, maybe a squirrel or two. But it was dead silent. Of course, I didn't mention it to the guys at first. Figured it was just a trick of the mind, maybe too many days out in the field messing with my senses. Turns out, it wasn't. I had 2 men with me, Mendoza and Farrell. Mendoza was sharp, a no-nonsense type of guy who could probably disarm a bomb with his eyes closed. Farrell, on the other hand, was green, new to the team, but quick on his feet. They trusted me, and I trusted them. I was used to leading guys into hell and back. But what we walked into that day wasn't hell. It was worse. We reached the scientist's supposed last known location, a small clearing deep in the woods. There was no sign of him, but we did find something. A tent, partially collapsed, and a few scattered belongings. Most people would assume the guy had just wandered off, got lost maybe, or injured himself, and couldn't make it back. But then we saw the blood. Now, I've seen my fair share of battlefield injuries, gunshot wounds, the works. But this wasn't your average cut or scrape. There were splatters on the tent, the ground, even some on the nearby trees. Mendoza knelt to examine the scene, and I could see the tension in his face. This isn't human blood, he muttered, more to himself than to us. I didn't question him. If there's one thing you learn in this line of work, it's to trust your gut. And Mendoza's gut was screaming. Farrell, being the new guy, looked pale. Not that I blamed him. The whole situation reeked of wrong. But we had a job to do. We fanned out, keeping low and quiet, searching for any sign of movement. That's when we found the tracks. Large, clawed. They didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen. They led away from the camp, deeper into the woods. We followed, of course. Call it duty? Call it stupidity. But something drove us forward. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the thought of leaving the scientist out there alone with whatever made those tracks. Whatever the case, we moved with precision, staying close, weapons at the ready. About an hour later, we found what was left of him. The body, what remained of it, wasn't something you'd put in a morgue. There wasn't enough left to even fill a casket. Bones, shredded flesh, and bits of clothing were all that we could recognize. Mendoza swore under his breath while Farrell retched into the bushes. Me, I kept my composure. Years of training, I guess. But I couldn't deny the unease that crept through me. Whatever had done this was big, powerful, and hungry. Then we heard the sound. It wasn't a roar, nothing so obvious. It was a low, rumbling noise, like a deep breath being exhaled from something much larger than it should be. Farrell gripped his weapon tighter, eyes darting around. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaky. Mendoza nodded, but said nothing. We all heard it. We just didn't know what the hell it was. Moments later, the forest seemed to shift, like something was watching us. Not the usual animal stalking its prey, but something with a kind of awareness. You ever feel eyes on you and just know that whatever it is, it's deciding whether to strike or not? Yeah, that's what it was like. Instinct kicked in. I ordered the men to fall back, slowly at first. We weren't about to go down without a fight, but I wasn't about to charge blindly into whatever that thing was, either. We never saw it coming. The first strike hit Mendoza. 1 second, he was there. Then, gone. Yanked off his feet and dragged into the trees so fast I barely had time to process it. I heard him scream, a sound so raw it cut through the silence like a blade. Farrell panicked, opening fire in the direction Mendoza disappeared. But it was useless. Bullets hitting nothing but leaves and bark. I grabbed Farrell, pulling him back toward the clearing. But whatever had taken Mendoza wasn't done. A massive shadow passed just beyond the tree line. Moving fast, too fast, it darted between trees, its movements almost unnatural, like it didn't need to follow the same rules of physics we did. And then it stopped. Farrell froze, staring at something in the distance. His gun fell to the ground with a soft thud as he whispered something I couldn't make out. I turned to see what he was looking at, and I'll never forget what I saw. It was like a bear, but worse, much worse. The thing's body was massive, hunched over, with muscle and fur that was patchy and matted. Its face, if you could call it that, looked like a twisted mix between a wolf and something far more primal. It didn't snarl. It didn't roar. It just stared at us, calculating. Before I could react, the thing moved again, its clawed hand slicing through the air with deadly precision. I shoved Farrell out of the way, but not before it caught him across the chest. The kid dropped like a rock, blood spilling onto the forest floor. He wasn't dead yet, but he would be soon. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the radio from my pack and called for extraction. The mission was over. There was no rescuing anyone. Not with this thing out here. We needed to get out, fast. The creature didn't seem interested in me, though. It kept its focus on Farrell, watching him writhe in agony, like it was fascinated by the process of death. I don't know why it didn't finish him off right then and there. Maybe it wanted to savor the moment. Maybe it just didn't care. I wasn't sticking around to find out. I bolted back toward the camp. By the time the chopper arrived, I was the only one left. The pilot asked me what happened. I told him we were ambushed. Didn't go into detail. Didn't need to. They knew. And I think that thing is still out there. It was 2002, a year that's burned into my memory for reasons I'd rather forget. I've always preferred the quiet, the sort of silence you find out here in the dense forests of eastern Idaho. The Army taught me that, how to appreciate the quiet. My name is Jeremy Harris, and I was a Green Beret, trained to handle situations most people can't even imagine. But there are some things they don't prepare you for, no matter how many drills you run or how many nights you spend in the wilderness. This mission was supposed to be straightforward. No firefights, no insurgents to hunt. It was a training exercise, a solo recon out in the Clearwater National Forest. You might think they wouldn't bother sending a veteran like me for something that mundane, but I had a knack for navigating rough terrain, and they figured I'd use the time to scope out a few potential routes for future drills. It was the third day in, and I was camped by a creek. eating one of those MREs that taste like cardboard wrapped in nostalgia. I was thinking about how I missed real food, the kind my ex-wife Sarah used to make before things went south between us. I don't know. Maybe that's what started the chain of bad luck, thinking about old mistakes. She used to say my job would eat me alive one day, like she had some kind of crystal ball. I was stirring the remnants of my meal when I heard the first snap, a branch breaking somewhere to my left. Now, animals do that all the time, but there's a difference between a deer stepping wrong and something with weight. My training kicked in, but I brushed it off. I'd faced worse than a curious bear or a lost elk. Then came the second sound, a wet crunching noise, like teeth breaking through bone. It made my skin itch. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and scanned the trees. Nothing, just a wall of dark, dripping with the moisture from the creek. I didn't like it, but I forced myself to sit back down. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a fallen tree, an overactive beaver, whatever. I tried to keep my focus on the map in front of me, charting out the route I'd take in the morning. That plan fell apart when the noise came again, closer this time, followed by a low, dragging sound like something being pulled across the forest floor. That's when I realized this wasn't some lost hiker or an animal looking for a meal. This was something else. I grabbed my sidearm and flashlight and moved toward the sound, trying to keep my steps quiet. The crunching grew louder, and so did a wet, sucking sound that I'll never forget. It's the kind of sound that stays with you, even in the silence of your thoughts. As I edged closer, I caught a whiff of something foul, a mix of rotting meat and wet earth. I don't scare easily, but there's a difference between fear and knowing when you've walked into something you're not supposed to see. My light caught on a shape, a hulking mass hunched over something in the brush, broad shoulders moving with each grotesque motion. The thing was eating, and it wasn't eating anything that belonged out here in the woods. I stepped on a twig, and its head jerked up. My light caught its face, or what I thought was a face. It had a snout like a boar, with sharp, uneven teeth jutting out at odd angles. The rest of it looked like some sort of twisted wolf, but larger, more muscular. Its skin hung loose in patches, exposing slick, pale flesh underneath. I know the size of predators. But this thing? It wasn't natural. It had to be 7 feet tall if it stood up. It dropped the half-eaten arm of what looked like a man, and I realized then that it had been gnawing on a body. The remains were torn apart, scattered in a mess of blood and flesh, with eyes staring up through the darkness, wide open and vacant. It sniffed the air, nostrils flaring as it caught my scent. I've seen fear in enemy combatants, but nothing compares to the raw, animal rage in that thing's face. I fired off a shot, aiming center mass like I'd been trained, but it barely flinched. The sound echoed through the trees, and the thing let out this deep, rasping sound before it lunged at me. It moved faster than anything that big should, closing the distance between us in seconds. I ducked behind a tree, barely missing the swipe of its claws, each one like a sickle. My mind raced through every tactic I'd been taught, every move I could make. Running wasn't an option. I took aim again, this time for its shoulder, hoping to slow it down. The shot hit, and it snarled, more irritated than hurt. I stumbled back, slipping on the wet undergrowth, and my flashlight went flying, leaving me in almost total darkness. There was a clearing up ahead, maybe 50 yards. If I could make it there, I might have a chance to call for backup. I ran like hell, hearing it crashing through the brush behind me. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept pushing. The thought of what that thing could do if it caught me was the only motivation I needed. I burst into the clearing and turned, aiming my pistol again. It followed, slower now, favoring the shoulder I'd shot. I emptied the rest of the clip into its chest, but it just staggered back, not stopping. It wasn't invincible, but it sure as hell wasn't going down easy. I felt around for my spare mag, cursing myself for not bringing a bigger weapon. But then I noticed it. Under the moonlight, glinting off something wrapped around its leg. A rusty trap, the kind you see in old hunter cabins, snapped around its ankle. It must have been dragging it for miles, and it was slowing it down. I kept my distance, watching as it struggled with the trap, trying to claw it loose. It gave me enough time to spot an old, half-rotten cabin just beyond the tree line. Maybe it wasn't much, but it was shelter. I bolted for it, not caring how much noise I made anymore. Inside, I found a rusted hunting rifle on the wall. It looked like it hadn't been fired in decades, but the box of shells next to it gave me a sliver of hope. I loaded it as quickly as I could, propping myself by the window, waiting for the thing to appear. It crashed through the underbrush moments later, dragging its leg, eyes locked on the cabin. I steadied the rifle, aimed, and fired. The shot took it in the throat. It staggered, clutching at the wound. But then it looked up, and I swear it managed a twisted, almost mocking grin before it charged at the door. The rifle jammed. Of course it did. Just my luck. I grabbed a rusty machete from the floor and braced myself. When it broke through the door, I swung hard, catching it across the face. It roared and swung back, claws catching my side, leaving a searing pain that made me see stars. It didn't let up, pinning me to the ground with its weight, claws digging into my chest. I fought back, jamming the machete into its side again and again, until it finally collapsed on top of me, heavy and stinking of blood and decay. I wriggled out from underneath, panting and bleeding, staring at the still body of that thing. I didn't know if it was dead, but I wasn't waiting around to find out. I staggered back to my camp, grabbed my radio, and called for an evac. They sent a helicopter out, and I didn't stick around to watch them clean up the mess. I heard later that they found the remains of 4 other people, all half-eaten and scattered through the woods. And the creature's body? Last I heard, they hauled it off to some undisclosed location, wrapped in a tarp. They told me to keep my mouth shut, that it was classified, that the families would get closure without knowing the truth. I nodded, signed their papers, and walked away. There was a time when I'd have fought them, demanded answers. But honestly, I was just glad to be done with it. I kept the scar across my ribs, though. A reminder, I guess. Not that I need one. You don't forget the sound of teeth breaking bone. My name is Gabriel Allen, and back in 2021, I decided to take my RV out to the remote stretches of Badlands National Park in South Dakota. Being a city dweller from Chicago, I thought some solitude might help clear my head. A sort of detox from the daily grind. Funny how the promise of peace can lead you straight into chaos. I've always been a fan of open spaces. Maybe it's because my apartment overlooks a brick wall. Or perhaps it's the allure of horizons that don't end in skyscrapers. Either way, I packed up my RV with the essentials. Canned beans, a stack of paperbacks I'd been meaning to read, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The drive was uneventful, which is more than I can say for most road trips I've taken. No flat tires, no wrong turns, just mile after mile of asphalt, leading me away from the buzz of the city. As I pulled into the park, the rugged beauty of the Badlands stretched out before me, jagged rock formations painted in hues of red and orange. The kind of place that makes you feel both insignificant and profoundly alive. I found a secluded spot to park the RV, away from the handful of other campers sprinkled throughout the area. Privacy was the goal, after all. Setting up camp was a breeze. I even managed to assemble a folding chair without losing a finger, a personal victory considering my track record with DIY projects. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small campfire. The crackling of the wood was the only sound for miles, or so I thought. Just as I was getting comfortable, a rustling noise came from behind a nearby cluster of shrubs. Probably just the wind, I told myself, or maybe a rabbit. I wasn't exactly versed in the local wildlife, but I figured nothing out here would be too keen on bothering me. First night in the wilderness, and I'm already jumping at shadows, I muttered, shaking my head. I took a sip of lukewarm coffee and decided to call it a night. Sleep came surprisingly easy, but it didn't last long. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a distant scream, a sharp, piercing cry that echoed through the stillness. I sat up, heart pounding. Probably just a coyote, I whispered, though deep down, I knew that wasn't the howl of an animal. Curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the cool night air. The campgrounds were enveloped in darkness, the kind that swallows the beam of a flashlight whole. I scanned the area, but saw nothing unusual. "Is anyone out there?" I called out, immediately realizing how cliché it sounded. No response. Just the gentle whisper of the wind against the rock formations. I shrugged it off and headed back inside. Next time, maybe pack a sense of courage, I joked to myself, attempting to lighten the mood. The next morning, I decided to do a bit of hiking. The trails were well marked, and I figured a daytime adventure would be less unnerving. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd hear the crunch of gravel behind me, but when I turned around, the path was empty. "Get a grip, Gabriel. You're not the star of some thriller novel," I chided myself. About an hour into the hike, I came across something that made my stomach churn. A campsite that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. A tent collapsed, belongings scattered, and a half-burned-out fire still smoldering. Maybe they left in a rush? Emergency, perhaps? I mused aloud. But the eerie silence suggested otherwise. I noticed a backpack leaning against a tree. Unable to quell my curiosity, I unzipped it and found a wallet with an ID, Mark Stevenson, a guy not much older than me. There were also keys, a phone with a dead battery, and a notebook filled with sketches of the surrounding landscapes. Doesn't look like someone who planned to leave, I thought. A rustling sound snapped me out of my thoughts. This time, it was unmistakably close. I spun around, but again, nothing. "All right, joke's over," I shouted, half expecting someone to jump out laughing. But there was only silence. Deciding it was best to head back, I started retracing my steps. The feeling of being watched intensified. Every crunch of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. Then I saw it. A figure in the distance, partially concealed behind a rock. I couldn't make out any features, but it was definitely a person. "Hey, you okay over there?" I called out. No response. The figure remained still. "Listen, if you're lost, I can help," I offered, taking a cautious step forward. Without warning, the figure darted behind the rock and out of sight. "Well, that's not ominous at all," I muttered. I picked up the pace, eager to get back to the safety of my RV. As I neared the campsite, a metallic smell hit me, sharp and unmistakable. Blood. My heart raced. As I approached my RV, the door was ajar, which I was certain I'd closed. Inside, the place was a mess, drawers pulled out, belongings strewn about, and on the small kitchenette table lay a hunting knife, stained red. "Okay, this is officially the worst vacation ever," I whispered, panic creeping in. A noise from the back of the RV made me freeze. Footsteps. Someone was still inside. Thinking quickly, I grabbed a heavy flashlight, my only potential weapon, and prepared myself. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. Then a low chuckle emanated from the shadows of the hallway leading to the bedroom area. "Not funny, man. Show yourself," I shouted. A tall figure stepped into the dim light, a man with a gaunt face, dirty clothes, and eyes that seemed devoid of any humanity. "Looking for something?" he sneered. "Listen, take whatever you want and leave." "I don't want any trouble," I said, gripping the flashlight tighter. He tilted his head, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "But I've already found what I want." Without warning, he lunged at me. I swung the flashlight, by connecting with his shoulder. He stumbled back, but recovered quickly. "Feisty one, aren't you?" he taunted. I didn't wait for his next move. I bolted out of the RV, sprinting toward the main road. My mind raced. There was no one around for miles, and my cell phone was inside. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps gaining. "You can't run forever," he yelled, laughter trailing his words. Spotting a cluster of rocks ahead, I veered off the path and ducked behind them, trying to catch my breath. "Great plan, Gabriel. Lead the psycho to an isolated spot," I chastised myself. I scanned the area for anything I could use as a weapon. Nothing but rocks and dirt. The footsteps slowed. He was close. "Why make this hard on yourself?" His voice echoed, desperate. I remembered the small multi-tool in my pocket, a Swiss Army knife I'd brought along for minor repairs. Hardly intimidating, but better than nothing. As he approached, I steadied my breathing. The moment he rounded the corner, I kicked up a cloud of dust into his eyes. He snarled, rubbing his face. Seizing the opportunity, I plunged the small blade into his thigh. He let out a howl of pain. "That's going to leave a mark," I quipped, adrenaline fueling my sarcasm. He swung wildly, but I dodged and took off again, heading toward the abandoned campsite I'd seen earlier. Maybe there was something there I could use. Reaching the site, I frantically searched the scattered belongings. Then I saw it, a flare gun, half buried under a sleeping bag. "Time to light up your life," I muttered, grabbing it. He emerged from the trail, limping but no less menacing. "You're making me angry, and you wouldn't like me when I'm angry," he growled. "Did you really just quote the Hulk? Points for style, I guess," I shot back. He charged at me, and I fired the flare gun. The bright projectile hit him square in the chest, igniting his shirt. He screamed, desperately trying to pad out the flames. Not wasting any time, I ran past him, heading back toward the main road. Smoke filled the air, and his screams faded into the distance. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights, a park ranger's vehicle making its evening rounds. I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms. "Whoa there, are you all right?" the ranger asked, stepping out. "There's a man back there. He attacked me. I think he killed someone." I gasped. "Slow down. Where is he now?" the ranger pressed. "At the abandoned campsite, about 2 miles back." "We need to call for backup," I insisted. He radioed for assistance and helped me into the vehicle. As we drove back, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and lingering dread. When we reached the site, there was no sign of the man, just the charred remains of his shirt and bloodstains on the ground. A team arrived shortly after and began a thorough search. Over the next few hours, they uncovered a shallow grave not far from the campsite. Inside were the remains of Mark Stevenson and another unidentified victim. "Looks like you stumbled upon something big," the lead investigator told me. "We've been tracking reports of missing hikers in this area for months." "Who is he?" I asked. "Name's Victor Reynolds," he replied. "Former military, gone rogue, wanted for multiple counts of murder." In that moment, it all clicked. The abandoned campsite, the eerie feeling of being watched, the calculated way he hunted me. "Well, I always wanted a memorable vacation," I said, attempting a weak smile. The investigator shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive." I nodded, exhaustion washing over me. As they continued their work, I realized that sometimes the peace we seek comes with unexpected dangers. And perhaps next time, I'd stick to crowded beaches. The road into the Boundary Waters was a frozen ribbon through a sea of snow, the trees standing like silent sentinels under heavy blankets of ice. The RV's heater hummed steadily, but even that couldn't keep the biting cold out. I was deep into the wilderness now, the place I'd picked to spend a week, just me, the frozen lake, and the stillness of winter. I'd been coming to places like this for years, ever since the accident. The solitude was the only thing that seemed to quiet my mind. This time, I was here to ice fish, maybe snap a few photos for my nature blog, but mostly I was here to prove to myself that I could still handle it. The cold, the isolation, the memories. I pulled the RV to a stop by a small frozen lake I'd scouted on a map. It was miles away from the nearest town, completely off the grid, just how I liked it. I stepped out into the icy air, my breath fogging in front of me as I took in the sight. The lake was a vast white expanse, the ice thick enough to drive on, stretching out into the distance where the trees disappeared into a blur of white. Perfect. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV near the shoreline and gathering my gear for ice fishing. The cold had a way of creeping into your bones out here, but I didn't mind. I was used to it. I grabbed my auger, trudged out onto the ice, and started drilling a hole. The sound of the blade biting into the ice echoed through the stillness, sharp and harsh against the quiet of the wilderness. Then I heard it, a deep, low rumble that seemed to come from beneath the ice. I paused, the auger still in my hands, and listened. The sound came again, a low, distant vibration like the ice shifting far beneath the surface. I'd heard ice groan before. Anyone who spends enough time in the cold knows the sound of a lake adjusting to the freeze, but this was different. It was deeper, longer, almost like something was moving down there. I brushed it off and kept drilling. By the time the hole was ready, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. I set up my fishing gear, lowered the line into the icy water, and settled in to wait. The cold crept in quickly, even through my heavy coat, but I was prepared for it. I'd done this 100 times before, and the routine was comforting. But that sound, the rumble beneath the ice, kept creeping back into my thoughts. As night fell, I lit a small fire near the shore, the flames flickering weakly against the chill. I sat by the fire, staring out at the frozen expanse of the lake. The stars were starting to appear in the clear sky above, bright and distant. Then I saw it. A light, faintly flickering and coming from beneath the ice. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe the moonlight hitting the ice in just the right way. But as I watched, the light moved slow and steady, as if something was drifting beneath the surface. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it was still there, faint and regular, like a lantern swaying beneath the ice. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the lake. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter for a moment, then dimming again, always moving, always just out of reach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a reflection of something from the sky. But deep down, I knew better. There was no one else out here, no one who could be moving under the ice. The rumble came again, louder this time, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. I took a step back, suddenly feeling exposed out there on the open ice. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I turned back toward the RV, my mind racing. The light, the sound. Something wasn't right. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back out onto the lake, determined to make sense of it all. The sun was barely up, and the cold was more biting than ever. As I walked, I glanced back toward the hole I drilled the day before. Something was off. There, by the edge of the hole, was a long, jagged crack running across the ice. The crack hadn't been there yesterday. It snaked out in a jagged line, as if something had pressed up from below. I knelt down, running my gloved fingers along the crack, feeling the cold seeping through the ice. The surface felt thin, too thin for the middle of winter. Then I noticed something glinting just beneath the ice. I leaned closer, peering into the crack. At first, it looked like a piece of metal, rusted and sharp, lodged beneath the surface. I reached into the cold water, pulling it free. It was old, jagged, like part of a machine, but there was no reason for it to be here. The nearest road was miles away, and there hadn't been any mining or construction in the area for years. The metal was strange, sharp and smooth, like it had been cut clean. As I held the piece in my hand, the rumbling came again, louder now, closer. I stood quickly, scanning the lake. The light was back, faint but steady, moving beneath the ice, closer than before. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out under my coat. Something was down there. Something was moving. I backed away from the crack, my mind racing. The metal, the light, the sound, it all pointed to something beneath the ice. Something unnatural. But what? The stories I had heard over the years about strange things beneath the frozen lakes, about disappearances and creatures buried deep in the ice, came flooding back. I'd always dismissed them as nonsense, campfire stories to scare the newcomers. But now, standing there in the middle of the frozen lake, I wasn't so sure. I needed answers. Later that day, as I was gathering more firewood, I came across an old ice fishing shack near the edge of the lake that looked abandoned. But there were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the door. Curious, I approached, knocking lightly before pushing the door open. Inside, I found an older man hunched over a small stove, warming his hands. His face was weathered, his beard streaked with gray, and he looked up at me with tired eyes as I stepped in. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Not many come this deep into the wilderness." I hesitated. "I've been hearing strange sounds under the ice, and I saw a light last night, moving beneath the surface. Do you know anything about that?" The man's expression darkened. He turned back to the stove, staring into the flames. "You shouldn't be out on that lake," he said quietly. "There are things beneath the ice, things that shouldn't be disturbed." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. The man sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. There's an old mining operation under that lake, abandoned long ago. They were digging deep, too deep. Some say they woke something up down there. Ever since, strange things have happened. People go missing. The ice breaks when it shouldn't. And that light, it's not the only thing that moves down there. A chill ran down my spine. What's under there? The man shook his head. I don't know. But I've been coming out here for years, and I've seen enough to know when something isn't right. The lake's alive. It's watching you. That night, the light beneath the ice returned, brighter than before, pulsing like a heartbeat. I watched from the RV, my breath fogging up the window, as the rumbling beneath the ice grew louder, more insistent. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was beneath the lake, it was waking up. I packed my gear quickly, throwing everything into the RV. But as I started the engine, the ground beneath the RV began to tremble. The rumbling was almost deafening now, vibrating up through the frozen earth. I glanced out toward the lake, and my blood ran cold. The ice was cracking, long fissures spreading out from the center of the lake. And then, in the distance, the surface of the ice exploded upward, a massive shape breaking through. I only caught a glimpse, something dark and enormous, sliding beneath the ice again, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But it was enough. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward as I raced away from the lake, the sound of cracking ice echoing behind me. The road was a blur, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I drove, I could still feel it, the weight of something massive beneath the surface, watching, waiting. When I finally reached the main road, the rumbling stopped. But the memory of that thing beneath the ice stayed with me. I'll never forget it. The way the light pulsed, the way the ice cracked as if it were alive. I left the boundary waters behind, but a part of me knows I'll never truly escape it. Some things should stay buried. And whatever's beneath that lake, it's not finished yet. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as if the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I'd heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps. One locals swore disappeared and reappeared as if it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it, film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera, set it up, and filmed a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore are fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in spiraling symbols that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving. The trees closed in tighter, and the trail became fainter, more overgrown. Soon, it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping the camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment, there had been a clear path. Now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, alone, in the fog. Okay, I muttered. You've dealt with worse. I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. "You lost too?" The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. "I've been walking for days," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trail, it keeps changing." "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. "No one's okay out here." I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The trail. It moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path. It's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look, I have a GPS," I said, pulling it out. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get this guy some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago would be choked with brambles. When I looked back, trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees. Thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked Eli. He nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us." The forest, I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around like he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers grew louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around, and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen. Shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal, the mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me, and I had a feeling it was waiting somewhere in the mist for me to return. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, immersed in the silence for hours, but now something felt off, the kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life, birds, insects, something. But the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day, no stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walked over to the RV, and ducked inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers. 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing. I was sure of it, but the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone, it was for me. I shut the radio off. My fingers were trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods. The towering pines loomed overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. "I heard it too," he said. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal, the numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer, his voice low. "I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals, glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7, 8. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes constantly scanned the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "You think it's some kind of broadcast?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. "I don't think it's a broadcast at all." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I think it's a warning, or a signal from something out there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. And then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. "We see you." My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. "We see you." I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. "I think we should leave," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles. The battery drained faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 1, 3, 7. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected, an old dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, test every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small glowing device pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once, an unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, like something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but the lights followed me, the clicking never far behind. But I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am. And it's not done with me yet. I thought the desert would heal me. Red Rock Canyon was supposed to be a place to clear my head, to sit in silence and let the vast empty land take away the chaos of the last few months. I'd lost everything, my wife, my job, and I needed something, anything, to remind me there was still some peace left in the world. Instead, it felt like I'd driven into a nightmare. I parked the RV at the far end of the campground, as far away from the few other campers as I could get. I wanted solitude, to think, or maybe to stop thinking. I wasn't sure. The sun was setting as I stepped out, casting a deep orange glow across the red sandstone cliffs. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that made you feel small, like the world was too big for you to matter. Maybe that's what I needed. I'd been driving for hours, with only the occasional crackle of the radio for company. The RV was old, creaking and groaning as I navigated the winding roads into the canyon. It had seen better days, much like me. As I stretched, a low rumble came from under the hood. Great, I muttered, giving the RV a half-hearted kick. The engine had been acting up for days, but I figured I could deal with it later. I wasn't here for that. I was here to get away, to let the emptiness of the desert swallow me whole. That night, after I'd settled in, I sat outside the RV, staring up at the stars. Out here, away from the city, the sky was incredible, clear, endless. But as the stars twinkled overhead, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought they were planes, blinking in and out far above the canyon. But then they moved too fast, too erratically. I leaned forward, squinting. There were 3 of them, glowing faintly blue, darting through the sky in impossible patterns. They weren't planes. I wasn't sure what they were. I stood up, straining my neck to follow their path as they circled overhead. They blinked off one by one, and the desert was silent again. Just stars, I told myself, even though I knew it wasn't true. The next morning, I woke up to find the RV's battery almost dead. My phone, which I'd left charging overnight, hadn't gained a single bar. I tried turning the engine over, but all I got was a dull click. My chest tightened. Being stranded in the middle of the desert wasn't part of the plan. I had enough food and water for a few days, sure, but the isolation was starting to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. Milo's RV was parked a few spots down, his beat-up RV sitting in the shade of a large rock formation. He waved me over as I stepped out of mine, a wide grin on his sunburnt face. "Morning," he called. "Beautiful day, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. Hey, you wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" Milo scratched his scruffy chin, then shook his head. "Sorry, friend, but I can give you a ride into town later if you need help. It's not too far." I thanked him, but something about Milo unsettled me. Maybe it was how relaxed he seemed, like this place wasn't bothering him at all. As I stood there, he tilted his head toward the canyon walls. "You see the lights last night?" he asked. I froze. "Yeah, what were they?" He shrugged, like it was nothing. "Oh, those things. People talk about them all the time. That could be military, could be something else. No one really knows, but they've been around as long as I've been camping out here." I laughed nervously. "Something else, huh?" Milo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People say they're not from this world. I don't know about that, but sometimes they follow you. Just don't go too far out at night, and you'll be fine." I forced another laugh, but my stomach churned. Milo's tone was too casual, too accepting. I thanked him again and went back to my RV, trying to shake off the feeling that I was missing something important. The day dragged on, the heat baking the ground beneath my feet. I spent the afternoon hiking a short trail near the campground, trying to clear my head, but the vast emptiness only made me feel more alone. I kept thinking about the lights, about how they'd moved, how they seemed to watch me. That night, they returned. I was sitting outside again, nursing a warm beer and staring at the sky when I saw them. 3 faint blue lights hovering over the canyon. This time, they were closer. Too close. They flickered almost playfully, darting back and forth like they were searching for something. I stood up, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this place made sense. I backed toward the RV, never taking my eyes off the lights, but as I reached for the door, the lights blinked out. Gone. Just like that. A cold breeze swept through the canyon, and I shivered. It was too quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just the dead, suffocating silence of the desert. Then the RV lights flickered once, twice, and went dark. My chest tightened as I stumbled into the RV, fumbling for the flashlight. I clicked it on, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. The electrical panel was dead, and my phone wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing, and I had no idea why. A sudden knock on the door made me jump. "Chris, you okay?" It was Emily, the hiker I'd met earlier that day. She'd pitched her tent nearby, planning to stay for a few nights before heading out. I opened the door, trying to hide my panic. "Yeah, just some electrical issues," I said, forcing a smile. "Everything's dead. I'm guessing the battery's shot." Emily frowned, glancing back at her tent. "That's weird. My phone's dead too, and my flashlight keeps flickering." Her voice was calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She felt it too, the strangeness in the air, the weight of the silence. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you think it's the lights?" Milo told me about them earlier, said people disappear sometimes. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Disappear?" Emily nodded, her gaze drifting toward the canyon. "Yeah, it's mostly stories, but you seemed pretty convinced." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, heavy, like the desert was closing in on us. I wasn't sure if I believed in Milo's campfire tales, but the lights, they were real, and they weren't natural. "We should get out of here," Emily said, breaking the silence. "I don't like this." "I can't," I replied. "My RV won't start." She hesitated, then nodded. "Mine either. I tried earlier, but it's completely dead." We stood there, staring at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Something was wrong with this place. The lights weren't just an oddity. They were doing something, affecting everything around us. And we were stuck miles from any help. "We'll wait till morning," I said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe it's just a temporary glitch. We'll figure it out." Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded and headed back to her tent. I locked the RV door behind her, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. That night, I barely slept. The silence was oppressive, like a blanket wrapped too tight around me. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind made my heart race. I kept waiting for the lights to come back, to hover outside my window, but they didn't. Instead, I woke up sometime in the early hours, drenched in sweat, my head pounding. I sat up, blinking in the darkness. Something was wrong. I glanced at my watch. It was 4 a.m., but that didn't make sense. I'd checked the time just moments ago, and it had been midnight. Where had the hours gone? I stumbled outside, feeling disoriented. The air was cooler now, the desert's chill settling in. The stars were out, but there was no sign of the lights. My mind was foggy, like I'd been dreaming. But the dust on my boots told me I'd been walking. But where? And why? Panic surged through me. I couldn't remember. Hours were missing, and I had no idea what had happened. The lights were playing with us, toying with our sense of reality. I ran toward Emily's tent, calling her name, but when I got there, she was gone. Her tent was empty, her pack still there, but she was nowhere to be found. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. Nothing. The only sound was the wind. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the lights, the missing time, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. We weren't alone. I sprinted back to my RV, slamming the door behind me, and tried the engine again. To my shock, it roared to life. The headlights flickered on, and I didn't hesitate. I jammed the gear shift into drive and tore out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the winding canyon road. I glanced in the rearview mirror for just a second. I saw them. The blue lights, hovering in the distance, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I hit the outskirts of Las Vegas. The neon lights of the city felt like a lifeline. But even then, as I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights were still out there, waiting. and I wasn't sure if I'd really escaped at all. "6 months in the Smokies. 6 months. 6 whole months without touching a drop. I should have been proud, right? But sitting alone in this RV, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains, I didn't feel proud. I felt restless, empty, even the kind of empty that creeps up on you, settling in your bones when there's nothing but the sound of your own thoughts bouncing around your skull. This trip was supposed to be a celebration, a gift to myself for staying clean. I thought the solitude would help me clear my head, maybe give me some perspective. The Smokies had always been a place of peace for me. My dad used to take me camping here when I was a kid, back when life was simple, before the bottle got its hooks into me. I pulled out my phone, flicking through pictures of those old trips. My thumb hesitated over the last photo of my dad and me standing by a roaring campfire. That was before everything went to hell, before the drinking became my escape from everything I couldn't face. The phone buzzed, pulling me back to the present. It was my brother Jake, checking in as usual. "Hey, man," he said when I answered. "How's the trip? You hanging in there?" Jake was always the responsible one. Clean cut, married with kids, a steady job. He'd been my lifeline after the wreckage of my addiction. I owed him more than I could ever repay. "Yeah, it's good," I lied. "Just me and the trees. Peaceful." "You staying out of trouble?" I chuckled. "I'm not exactly near any temptations out here," I said. I didn't tell him about the bottle I'd brought with me. It sat in the back of the RV, unopened but still there, just in case. A cruel comfort. I'd stared at it more than once already, the amber liquid calling to me in the quiet. "Good to hear," Jake said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Just keep your head straight, all right? I know it's tough being out there alone, but you got this. Call me if you need anything." "I will. Thanks." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the trees. The sky faded from a soft orange to deep purple, and with it, the familiar sense of isolation began to settle in. The first night in the Smokies should have been serene, but as soon as the darkness took over, I felt it. The unease. The forest around me was too quiet. It was like it was holding its breath. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the faint crackle of my campfire outside. I sat at the picnic table near the fire, trying to relax, but the silence only seemed to grow heavier. I poked at the flames with a stick, hoping they'd somehow keep the stillness at bay. Then I heard it, a whistle, faint at first, like a breeze cutting through the trees, but unmistakably human. I froze, listening. It was tuneless, just a single drawn-out note that seemed to float through the air. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement. No one else was supposed to be this far out. I'd parked in a secluded area of the park, away from the main trails. The whistling continued, soft but constant. "Probably just the wind," I muttered to myself, but even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. It didn't sound like wind, it sounded deliberate. I stood, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, and slowly circled the fire. I kept the flames between me and the trees, my eyes darting between the dark shapes of the pines. The whistle came again, louder this time, closer. My heart hammered in my chest, the familiar anxiety clawing its way up my throat. "Who's there?" I called, my voice breaking the thick silence. No response, just another long drawn-out whistle. I grabbed my flashlight from the RV and swept the beam through the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were shadows. No footsteps, no crunch of leaves, just that damn whistling drifting through the trees like a ghost. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing, right? Just a trick of the wind. The mountains could be strange like that, especially at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The bottle of whiskey in the back of the RV started to look more and more appealing, but I shoved that thought down. I wasn't here for that. Not this time. To clear my head, I went for a hike, following a trail that wound through the dense forest. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. For a while it worked. I could almost forget about the night before. Almost. That's when I saw the first marking. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a rough, jagged symbol that looked like a spiral or maybe an eye. I couldn't tell. It didn't look natural, though. It felt intentional, like a warning. I ran my fingers over it, the grooves deep and uneven. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more of the symbols I saw. Spirals, faces, strange runes carved into the trees, all leading deeper into the woods. It felt like they were guiding me somewhere, though I wasn't sure I wanted to find out where. That night, the whistling returned. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to keep my mind off the bottle, when the sound came drifting through the trees. This time it wasn't soft, it was louder, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the forest. My heart pounded in my ears, my mouth went dry. The whistling seemed to circle the campsite, moving slowly but deliberately. It was all I could hear, filling the silence like a haunting lullaby. I turned, and that's when I saw him. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. A man, gaunt and pale, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood motionless, his lips pursed as he whistled that same eerie, tuneless note. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, cutting through the night air like a knife. I took a step toward him, but as soon as I moved, he turned and disappeared into the trees. My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, something deeper. I felt the urge to chase him, to follow that haunting sound, but my legs refused to move. I stayed by the fire until dawn, too scared to go back inside the RV. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed up my gear, grabbed the keys to the RV, and decided I'd had enough of the Smokies. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over, just a dull click. I swore under my breath, popped the hood, and checked the battery. Everything looked fine, but the damn thing wouldn't start. I tried calling Jake, but my phone was dead. I'd charged it the night before, but now it was completely drained. No signal, no service, nothing. The forest around me felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just beyond the trees. The whistling started again, faint at first, then growing louder like a taunting melody. I grabbed the bottle from the back of the RV. I wasn't going to drink it. Not yet. But holding it made me feel better, more in control, as if I could use it as a weapon somehow. That night, the stranger came back. I woke up to the sound of whistling, loud, sharp, right outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. He was standing by the fire pit, his pale face illuminated by the flames. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and that awful whistling filled the air, pressing in on me from all sides. He took a step toward the RV, and I felt the panic rise in my chest. I grabbed the bottle, holding it like a club, and stumbled outside. The air was freezing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whistling pierced through my skull, making it hard to think. I raised the bottle, ready to throw it, but then something stopped me. For the first time in days, I heard something else, a voice, faint but real. Jake's voice. "Nick, don't do it." I blinked, shaking my head. The stranger was gone. The whistling had stopped, and there, in the silence, I realized what I had been about to do. The bottle slipped from my hands and shattered on the ground. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The whistling was gone, but the fear, the isolation, it wasn't something I could run from. Not out here. Not anywhere. When the sun rose, I tried the RV again. This time, it started. I drove out of the Smokies that morning, not looking back. The whistling stayed behind, lost in the trees, but the memory of it, the temptation, would stay with me. 6 months sober. But this trip taught me something I hadn't been ready to face. Some demons don't live in bottles. They live in the silence, in the spaces we create for ourselves when we're trying to hide from the world. It was still dark when I arrived at Devil's Tower. The silhouette of the monolith rose above the horizon like a jagged alien structure. The first light of dawn barely touched the sky, but the outline was unmistakable. This place had always felt otherworldly, as if it didn't belong to the same earth the rest of us walked on. I parked the RV in the farthest corner of the campground, vast away from the few other visitors scattered throughout the park. I wanted isolation. Needed it, actually, after months of losing myself in work and failing to fix my crumbling marriage. I thought this trip might offer me some clarity. If nothing else, I had my research to keep me focused. Legends of Devil's Tower had fascinated me for years, but one in particular always stuck out. The legend of the Watcher. Native tribes in the region spoke of a spirit that guarded the tower. a being that offered ancient knowledge to those who sought it, but demanded a steep price in return. As a history professor obsessed with ancient folklore, I couldn't resist the lure of that story. I had come to Wyoming to dig deeper into those legends, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might be hiding in the shadows of the tower. I stepped out of the RV, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The towering spires of pine trees loomed around me, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. I unpacked my gear, set up camp, and grabbed my notebook. The plan was simple: hike around the base of the tower, take some notes, and maybe, just maybe, find something that would finally make all the pieces click. As I set out toward the trail that led to the tower, I passed an older man in a park ranger uniform, grizzled with deep lines etched into his face. His eyes were sharp, though, alert in a way that made me feel like he saw more than the average person. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "Morning," I replied, glancing briefly at his name tag. "Tom, you here for the sights or something else?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. I hesitated. "Research, mostly. I'm looking into some of the old Native American stories about the tower." He nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward Devil's Tower. "The Watcher, huh?" I stopped. I hadn't mentioned that specific legend. He chuckled softly. "Everyone comes looking for something. But you do well to leave the Watcher alone, son. Some things don't like being disturbed." I tried to brush off his warning with a nervous laugh. "You don't really believe that, do you, Tom?" He didn't smile. "Doesn't matter what I believe. Just be careful. People who go digging too deep around here sometimes find more than they bargain for." With that, he turned and walked back toward the ranger station, leaving me standing there with a pit forming in my stomach. I told myself it was just local superstition, the kind of thing park rangers said to spook tourists. But as I turned my eyes back to the tower, the weight of his words lingered. By midday, I was deep into my hike, circling the base of the tower, taking notes on the surrounding landscape. The towering rock formation loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the forest below. I felt dwarfed by it, like a child standing at the feet of a giant. That's when I noticed the eyes. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a glimmer of sunlight catching on something in the trees. But then I saw them again, faint, glowing orbs between the branches. They were high up, too high to be an animal, and they followed my every movement. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just hovered there, watching. I wanted to dismiss them as some kind of wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind them, something intelligent. Forcing myself to continue, I kept walking, occasionally glancing over my shoulder to see if the eyes were still there. They were always just far enough away to keep me wondering, but close enough that I could feel their presence. When I finally made it back to camp, the unease hadn't left me. I sat by the RV, trying to write in my notebook, but my mind kept drifting back to the eyes and the trees, the way they'd followed me, never straying too far, but never coming closer either. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the campground in shadow. The tower loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the purple sky. The fire I'd started crackled weakly, the flames flickering as if they, too, were uncertain about staying here. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I was a rational man, after all, a professor, a skeptic. But as the night wore on, that skepticism started to feel more like denial. The wind rustled through the trees, and the fire guttered low. Then, just as the last light of the day faded, I heard it. A whistle. It started softly, almost like the wind, but it was too distinct, too deliberate, a single drawn-out note that drifted through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood, scanning the darkness. The fire cast faint light around the camp. "Hello?" I called, though I wasn't sure what I expected to hear in return. The whistle came again, sharper this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam into the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, just the oppressive stillness of the forest. The whistling stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I sat back down, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of the trees, made me bolt upright, expecting to see those glowing eyes or hear that eerie whistle again. I told myself it was just my imagination, just nerves from being out here alone. But the uneasy feeling stuck with me, settling deep in my bones. The next day, I set out again, hoping to shake the paranoia that had settled over me. I hadn't gone far when I ran into Julie, a solo traveler I'd briefly noticed the day before. She was standing at the edge of the trail, staring up at Devil's Tower, a strange look on her face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said as I approached, though her tone didn't match her words. There was something off about the way she spoke, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. "Yeah," I replied. "I've been hiking around, looking into the old legends. You know about the Watcher?" She turned to me, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The Watcher? You're looking for it?" I nodded, uneasy. "It's just research." Julie's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The Watcher doesn't like to be found. You know, it watches, but it doesn't want to be seen." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about her was wrong. She seemed too calm, too knowing. The way she stared at me made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked back toward her campsite, leaving me standing there, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, the whistling returned, louder this time, persistent. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight, eyes darting between the trees. The whistle circled the campsite, moving closer than further away, like it was testing me, toying with me. Then, just beyond the flickering light of the fire, I saw him. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the woods. His face was pale, hollow-eyed, and his mouth was pursed as the tuneless whistle drifted from his lips. My throat tightened. "Who are you?" I asked. The figure didn't answer. He just stood there, whistling that same eerie note. My chest tightened with a sudden surge of panic. I stumbled back toward the RV, tripping over a rock and falling to the ground. When I looked up, he was gone. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me. The sound of my breath was too loud in the confined space. The next morning, I found footprints around the campsite, small indentations in the dirt, leading in circles around the fire. They hadn't been there before. On the final night, I couldn't take it anymore. The dreams of Devil's Tower had become unbearable, nightmares of the stone pulsing, breathing like a living thing. I dreamt of eyes, hundreds of them, watching me from the shadows, always watching. I had to go to the tower. I had to see it up close. I grabbed my gear and set out under the cover of darkness, the whistle guiding me, pulling me toward the monolith. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The stars above twisted and shifted, unfamiliar constellations blinking in and out of existence. As I neared the base of the tower, I saw her again. Julie, standing at the foot of the rock, her face pale and her smile too wide. "The Watcher is waiting," she whispered. "It's always been waiting." The whistle grew louder, piercing through my thoughts, driving me forward. I reached the tower, my hands trembling as I touched the cold stone. And then, out of the shadows, the Watcher appeared. It was a massive, shadowy figure, its body indistinguishable from the darkness, but its eyes glowing, burning orbs that stared into me, through me. It didn't speak with words, but its presence filled my mind, offering me ancient knowledge, secrets of the tower, of the universe, of myself. But the price. I could feel it gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The more I listened, the more I realized that accepting its offer would mean losing everything. My mind, my soul, everything that made me, me. I stumbled back, tearing myself away from the Watcher's gaze. The whistle reached a fever pitch, and I ran. The ground beneath me shifted and warped as the world collapsed around me. I barely made it back to the RV. When I crossed the threshold, the whistling stopped. The forest fell silent. I drove away as the first light of dawn touched the sky. The image of the Watcher's eyes burned into my mind. I knew I would never be the same. I've never been a superstitious man. Ghosts, spirits, curses, all of it felt like nonsense. My wife, Sarah, was the opposite. She loved all that mystical spiritual stuff. She'd go on and on about how some places had energies, or how she could feel something otherworldly when we'd visit a new place. I used to tease her for it. I didn't mean anything by it. I just never took it seriously. Now, I wish I had. It's been almost a year since Sarah died. I still don't know how to talk about it. I don't talk about it, really. I just packed up the RV one day and decided to drive to get away from everything. Her voice, her smile, the way she used to look at me when I'd roll my eyes at her hippie nonsense. It was all too much to deal with, so I left. I wasn't running from her memory exactly. More like I was trying to outrun the guilt that came with it. Sarah always wanted to visit the desert, especially the Navajo Nation. She said Monument Valley was one of the most spiritual places in the world. I never took her. Work got in the way, or my cynicism did. Either way, it never happened. And now, with nothing but miles of empty road ahead of me, I found myself driving right into that part of the world. Maybe it was my way of making up for it. The landscape around me was beautiful in an eerie, desolate way. Massive red rocks rising out of the desert, mesas silhouetted against the setting sun. The kind of place that made you feel small, insignificant. I parked the RV in a remote spot off an unmarked dirt road. No other campers around, just the endless stretch of desert and the towering rock formations in the distance. It was quiet, peaceful even. I thought maybe I'd finally get a decent night's sleep. I stepped out and walked a bit around the RV, taking in the silence. The air was cool, the sky already darkening with the stars beginning to shimmer into view. Sarah would have loved it. As I sat by the small campfire I'd built, poking at the flames, I thought I heard something in the distance. A howl, maybe? Coyotes. I figured it was nothing unusual in a place like this, but the sound was strange. More like a scream than an animal call. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind. Still, it gnawed at me. Something about the isolation felt different tonight. Heavier. I tried to shake the feeling and headed back into the RV. I locked the door out of habit, but deep down, I knew a lock wouldn't help me feel safe. Not tonight. The first sign that something wasn't right came early the next morning. I'd been outside sipping my coffee and watching the sun rise over the desert when I noticed the tracks. Big, too big to be a coyote. Canine-like, sure, but the prints were deeper, more defined, and there were too many of them. They were circling the RV in a wide arc. I crouched down to get a closer look. The spacing was wrong, like whatever had made them had a stride far longer than any normal animal. I shook my head. Probably a wolf, I reasoned, even though they weren't supposed to roam this part of the desert, or maybe a large dog from a nearby ranch. Either way, I wasn't about to get spooked over some tracks. I spent the day hiking, taking in the massive rock formations and the endless red sands. The wind carried whispers through the valleys, but I ignored it. I refused to let my mind play tricks on me. This was supposed to be my reset, my chance to process everything and finally move on. But that night, as the firelight flickered in front of me, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The coyotes started up again. At least I assumed they were coyotes. But the howls were different this time. Longer, more drawn out, closer. I told myself it was nothing. Tried to focus on the crackling fire, but the unease crept in anyway. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement on the ridge not far from the RV. A figure, tall, humanoid, but wrong somehow. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like it didn't quite know how to walk. I blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. My heart raced. I stood, trying to peer into the darkness, but there was nothing out there. Just empty desert. The howl stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. I doused the fire quickly and retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. I laughed at myself. A grown man terrified by shadows in the night. I was just exhausted, that was all. Grief and exhaustion made you see things that weren't there. I repeated that to myself as I crawled into bed. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. The next morning, I found more tracks. This time, they weren't just around the RV. They led right up to the windows, pressed deep into the sand, circling the vehicle like a predator stalking its prey. I stared at them, unease curdling in my stomach. These prints were bigger than the ones from yesterday. Deeper, too. Something was out here. Something that was getting bolder. I decided to leave. That morning, I packed up my things, double-checked the tires on the RV, and set the GPS for the nearest town. But as soon as I hit the ignition, the engine sputtered. It wouldn't start. "Come on, not now," I muttered, trying again. Nothing. I went outside to check the engine, hoping it was something simple. But when I popped the hood, everything looked fine. There was no reason for the RV to stall like this. Yet, There I was, stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal and no way to leave. As the day wore on, that strange feeling of being watched never left. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd catch sight of that figure again. But the desert was still dead quiet. That night, it came closer. I heard it long before I saw it. Footsteps outside the RV, soft at first, but growing heavier, more deliberate. Something was walking around, pacing as if deciding what to do next. I stayed perfectly still inside, listening as the footsteps circled the RV, stopping near the windows. Then came the scratching. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping against the side of the RV, but the sound was too methodical. It came in short bursts, like claws dragging across metal, testing the strength of the walls. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, slowly pulling back the curtain just an inch. My breath caught in my throat. There, outside in the dark, was the figure I had seen on the ridge. But it was clearer now, standing in the moonlight, just feet from the RV. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. It looked like a man, but its limbs were wrong. Too long, too thin. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its face, it was shifting, contorting, flickering between the face of a man and that of a coyote. It stopped scratching and turned toward the window, as if it could sense me watching. Its eyes, yellow and gleaming, locked onto mine for a moment. Time seemed to freeze. Then it bared its teeth in a sickening grin. I staggered back, heart pounding in my chest, and stumbled toward the door. I had to get out, had to run. But as soon as my hand reached for the latch, I heard it. "Mark?" I froze. "Mark, it's me." The voice, it was Sarah's. Soft, familiar, and filled with the love I hadn't heard in almost a year. I turned slowly, staring at the window. The figure outside had disappeared, but the voice lingered, echoing in the night. "Mark, come outside, please." I shook my head, tears burning in my eyes. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible. Sarah was gone. She was gone. But the voice, it sounded so real. I pressed my hands to my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Mark, come to me." I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the scratching returned. More violent this time, as if the creature was trying to claw its way inside. But I didn't open the door. I didn't go outside. The next morning, everything was quiet. No scratches, no footsteps, no voice. I stepped outside, and the desert was calm again. The tracks erased by the wind. The RV started without a hitch. I drove away from Monument Valley, leaving the cursed land behind. But the memory of that night, the voice of my wife, the creature in the dark, has followed me ever since. Some things can't be explained. Some things, I realize now, should never be disturbed. I'm not sure why I chose the Ocala National Forest. It wasn't really on my radar until a couple of weeks ago. Maybe it's because Megan always talked about it, how beautiful the pine forests were, the springs. She was the nature person, not me. She practically begged me to take her camping here once, back when we were still together. I kept putting it off, using work as an excuse. Now here I am, in the middle of the forest alone in my RV, with nothing but my thoughts for company. I needed a break. That's what my doctor said. "Unplug," he told me. "You need to find yourself again," as if I ever had a real grasp of who I was to begin with. 2 weeks into my forced time off, I wasn't any closer to finding peace or clarity. I felt off. I didn't realize how addicted I was to being connected. No emails, no social media, no news feeds, just silence and isolation. It was what I thought I wanted. The first night in the RV wasn't too bad. I parked in a secluded spot far from the main road, surrounded by towering pine trees. I managed to set up camp without any major problems. I had a fire going, and for a little while, I could almost see the appeal Megan always talked about. There was something peaceful about the forest, about the stillness. But it was the kind of stillness that quickly became unsettling when you were alone. By the time the sun set, the silence had grown thick. The only sound was the wind shifting through the pine needles and, every so often, the distant call of an owl. I tried to read one of the survival books I'd brought, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to her. Megan. We hadn't spoken since the divorce went through. 3 years of marriage dissolved in less than a month. I couldn't even tell you exactly when things went wrong. I just buried myself in work. She begged me to slow down, to reconnect, But I didn't listen. I told myself I was doing it for us, that the stress was worth it in the end. But by the time I realized how much I'd lost, it was too late. The fire crackled as the temperature dropped. I got up to grab my jacket from inside the RV. That's when I first heard it, a soft tapping sound, like something lightly knocking against the side of the RV. I froze, listening. Tap, tap, tap. I leaned against the door, listening harder. The tapping continued, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, scanning the area around the RV. The light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Just trees and shadows. Probably just a branch in the wind, I muttered to myself, though the trees weren't close enough to the RV for that to make sense. I shut the door and locked it. The tapping had stopped, but I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I drifted off, I heard something. Footsteps, rustling things I couldn't explain away as easily as I wanted to. But when I looked outside, the forest was still. The next morning, I found the footprints. They were in the dirt around the RV, large and oddly spaced. Not animal tracks, but not quite human either. They seemed too long, too wide, like someone had been walking on the balls of their feet with unnatural precision. They circled the RV, stopping near the windows before disappearing into the trees. I crouched down to get a better look. The prints were deep, the kind that didn't come from a person casually walking. Whoever or whatever had made them was heavy, deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though there was no one around. I considered leaving, but I wasn't going to let some footprints freak me out. Besides, my RV wouldn't start. No matter how many times I turned the key, the engine just sputtered and clicked. The GPS on my phone was glitchy too, pointing me in all sorts of random directions before it finally went blank. Great, just great. I spent most of the day walking, trying to calm my nerves. I stuck to the trails at first, but as the hours passed, I wandered deeper into the forest. The pine trees stretched up endlessly, their trunks so straight and uniform that I started losing track of where I was. I didn't mind being lost, not at first. It distracted me from the unease that had settled in my chest. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone, standing just beyond the trees. I stopped dead, staring at the figure. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally still. I blinked, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, but when I looked again, it was still there. A dark shape, humanoid but wrong, standing among the trees, watching me. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the forest. The figure didn't move. I took a step toward it, and in an instant, it vanished. Not like it walked away, just gone, like it was never there. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the spot where the figure had been, before I finally turned and hurried back toward the RV. That night, the tapping started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I lay in bed, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The rhythmic tapping echoed around the RV, coming from all sides. It sounded like someone or something was circling the vehicle, knocking at the walls, at the windows. I couldn't bring myself to move. Then the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate thuds like boots crunching on gravel. They moved slowly, methodically, pacing back and forth outside the RV. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking, and crawled out of bed. "Stop it," I whispered to myself. "You're imagining things. It's nothing." But I wasn't imagining it. I peered through the window, and there it was, the figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. Its shape was clearer now, a tall, gaunt figure with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. I stumbled back from the window, heart racing. The tapping grew more frantic, the footsteps louder. My head spun with fear and confusion. What was it? Why was it here? I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a voice. "David." I froze. It was Megan's voice, soft, familiar, and unmistakable. "David, come outside." My breath caught in my throat. "Megan?" I whispered, barely able to speak. "Come to me." I stared at the door, my hand trembling on the latch. The voice was so clear, so real, but Megan wasn't here. She couldn't be. It wasn't her. "David, please." The voice grew more insistent, more urgent, but something in the tone was wrong, off. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping and footsteps stopped all at once, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the forest felt different, lighter somehow. The figure was gone, and the RV started on the first try. I didn't waste any time. I packed up and drove away, leaving the forest behind as quickly as I could. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, that maybe, just maybe, I didn't leave it behind. Some things can't be explained. Some things I realize now are better left undisturbed.